Journalists Roundtable is a half-hour discussion with Pennsylvania journalists about the week's top political news and current events. Journalists Roundtable is a production of PCN, a nonprofit television network. Listeners like you make our programming possible. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to Journalists Roundtable. I'm Ellen France. Our guests today are Justin Sweitzer, Managing Editor of City and State PA, Stephen Caruso, Capitol Reporter with Spotlight PA, and Whitney Downard, Reporter with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Welcome, everyone. Governor Josh Shapiro gave his final budget proposal of his first term this week. What stood out to you in this year's address? Whitney, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so what stood out to me was how much was kind of a repeat from last year. We still had skills games, marijuana, legalization, and just not really anything that we hadn't heard of, 4 months ago. It's not really clear what exactly has changed in the last few months since we just signed the budget in November, but a lot of it is pretty similar to what was suggested previously, and lots of spending a little bit more than we actually are predicted to take in and dipping into that surplus to make up the difference and suggesting up new revenue sources. So I think that's a lot of what stood out to me.
Stephen, do you want to jump in on that too?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think what also stood out to me, like as Whitney said, like the budget would spend more money than we projected to take in, even if Shapiro got all of his wishes on revenue. So there's also a lot of stuff in that address that isn't monetary, that doesn't require the state to spend money, or like he called for a lot of housing policy changes that like on land use, on sealing eviction records, utility policy. That's a huge fight. That doesn't necessarily mean the state has to spend money, but could potentially have an impact. Talking about re-upping some old consumer protections that last in 2024, the Chapter 14 protections. Wanting to even maybe take a look at utilities profit margins with a state law. Not that those aren't heavy lifts, not that they aren't impactful, but it doesn't require a, 10, 20, 50, 100, $500 million state appropriation to do them. And that you can find the address like littered with examples of this. And I think in some ways too, it's another acknowledgement of the state's financial situation.
Justin.
Yeah, to Stephen's point, there were a lot of proposed policy changes and I think policy wish list items that Shapiro outlined in this budget. I think one thing we saw was he wants to create a $100 million federal response fund using rainy day fund dollars to essentially have a fund to use to combat impacts from federal government actions. Something his administration referenced was delayed SNAP payments that we saw last year as a result of the federal government shutdown. Their argument on Tuesday was that having some sort of flexible pot of money to use in emergencies, if we don't get the FEMA funding we're expected to receive, this is something we should have in a time when the landscape of the federal government is a little shaky and unpredictable. And another thing that stood out to me was, we're hearing a lot about data center development in Pennsylvania, with the growth of AI and just, general growing data needs. And so Shapiro outlined this 4-point idea that his administration is using when it comes to data center development, things like companies bringing their own power on board, hiring local workers, committing to environmental standards and water protection standards. So there were some interesting wish list items in this budget that I think will be intriguing to me to keep an eye on as we go through budget hearings in the next several weeks.
How would you describe the tone of the governor's address?
I think it seemed bold. It seemed like this was a moment for him to outline a lot of things he wants, and he didn't shy away from getting combative at points. He's long pushed for reform to the state statute of limitations laws to allow sexual violence survivors to file civil suits against their abusers, and he straight up called out Senate Republicans on the House floor And that was something that drew a bit of a rebuke from Republicans later in the day. So I think I would describe it as a bold budget address.
Now, Stephen, last year, public transportation needed special funding from the governor during the impasse so that SEPTA didn't cut lines and et cetera. Do you see that as an issue that's going to happen again this year?
Well, and this is kind of the interesting thing, as we were talking about, is that like the state's financial situation isn't great and the budget does spend more than we take in. Transit's expensive. To fill in just the bare minimum of what a lot of agencies across the state, from SEPTA to PRT to smaller bus and, but bus lines, you're looking at $300 million minimum. That's the governor's proposal, and transit advocates say it could be more. And the governor's proposal won't even kick in until 2027, according to his budget pitch. That it's sort of a even if you got it done this year and you've picked that fight, you're not looking at more dollars getting to all of the Commonwealth's agencies for another year and a half. So with that said, I imagine the fight could happen. Senate, House Democrats, Senate Democrats have said that's still something they're interested in. Transportation is a tricky issue. It really was a big part of why last year's budget was late. But the governor, very briefly mentioned in his remarks, and then kind of moved on to some of the other stuff we've been talking about: data centers, housing, reforming laws around aging and mental health and whatnot, and professional licensing. So I think that kind of just again points to the fact that with it being such an expensive issue, until the state sort of gets its hands around its financial situation, it's a hard one to address head on. I expect that there will be legislative conversations around it, but a lot of people who've been through multiple budgets note that the governor really is in the driver's seat. The budget address kicks things off. Legislators can kind of cut their own deals around the side, but something as big as transportation probably requires all five parties to be there. And the governor mentioned it, but if the governor isn't really kind of setting an agenda, then that makes it hard to get done. And transit advocates were already at the gate being they didn't think that this budget pitch is what transit needed. It doesn't meet the moment. So I think it could happen, but it's worth keeping an eye on to see just do people's rhetoric on this change.
Whitney, you mentioned earlier a lot of things being recycled from last year's budget, such as legalizing adult use marijuana and skill games regulations. What are the chances this year of those getting through the legislature?
I do want to actually add one more thing, since we've been talking about housing and data centers. There was a proposal actually to leverage some of our general obligation bonds to fund debt, which would actually require the state to take on a long-term debt obligation to pay for large housing projects, energy infrastructure. And I'm a little curious to see that, we're not only just spending more than we're taking in, we're not only dipping into our surplus, but we're also taking this general obligation bond debt. And I think that's just really interesting to see this kind of appetite for wanting to do these huge, large projects that are kind of going to deliver to constituents, but doesn't necessarily match with what our financial reality is. I think that, there's been a really big push for cannabis for several years now. They mentioned several times that other states have legalized all around us, and maybe it's time for Pennsylvania to also get in on that. I'm not exactly sure if there's still that appetite in the Republican legislature, amongst the Republicans in the legislature, but I think it's still something that you're going to have to wait and see whether or not we can get any momentum on either of those.
Now, Whitney, another thing that was brought up from previous budget addresses of Governor Shapiro's, as well as his predecessor, Governor Wolf, was raising the minimum wage. Is there a chance that could go through this year?
I'm not quite sure. I think the House has made it very clear. The House Democrats have passed a bill to raise the minimum wage several times, and Senate Republicans have continued to not act on it. I think that you're going to need to see a little more willpower from their constituents who are maybe pushing on those Republicans to get something like that across the line. But I feel like there's just so many asks in this budget that you're really going to have to prioritize which ones you actually want to get going.
I will jump in on minimum wage. One thing I thought was interesting is that, not only did Governor Shapiro pitch it as a potential revenue generator along with legal cannabis and skill game tax revenue, but he also proposed it as a way to save the state money from getting people off of entitlement programs, and that was something he hadn't really done before. And it seemed to be a new way of him trying to sell this argument for raising the minimum wage. So maybe as the state feels more of a financial crunch, we'll see that argument get pressed a little bit. But I think to Whitney's point, we've seen these proposals fought for year after year after year. So I think we're just going to have to see what gets prioritized.
And we've been talking a lot about the rainy day fund and how the governor wants to take some revenue from that. That was something that a lot of Republicans were hesitant about last year, the budget passage. What have you heard this year so far from them?
Yeah, I think Republicans want to avoid touching that as much as possible. They point to the state's improved credit rating, improved financial position, and they say that's in large part due to their fiscal stewardship, their focus on getting more money into the rainy day fund. Joe Pittman this week said it's going to be hard to not have a conversation about the rainy day fund, but that he metaphorically wants to look under all the couch cushions and stretch tax dollars as much as possible. So I think as we see the structural deficit where expenditures are climbing and our revenues are dropping get worse, I think it's probably going to have to be a part of the conversation. And I think it's the fact that this was the first time Shapiro proposed pulling from the rainy day fund, and I think in any of his budgets, is telling of where we're at as a Commonwealth when it comes to our finances. So I think it will become part of the conversation, whether it happens this year or another.
Stephen, was there anything not included in the governor's proposal that you were expecting him to mention?
I mean, no, I'll be honest, I cannot think of anything. I jokingly made a bingo card before the address. This is something I've started doing, and there were almost too many bingos, which means that, I can't say there are any real surprises. I think the constant refrain I heard from reporters, lawmakers, observers writ large is how much this did feel similar to last year's budget, and even kind of the budget before that. The main thing is just this is his lowest spending proposal since of his entire first term. It's about a 5% spending increase. I'll go back to just, Whitney brought up that $1 billion bond program. I think that is by far the most interesting to me in terms of what it says and what it means. Justin was talking about the fact that this is a budget that would pull from the rainy day fund, and Republicans even acknowledging that. But the Senate Appropriation Chair Scott Martin noted that it's a tricky situation to be in if you're both trying to float $1 billion of debt and then also driving down your reserves, drawing them down, because you're kind of making two signals at once to the banking industry, to lenders, that okay, so even though we have to use our reserves because we're not bringing up our revenue, we also want to take out more debt. Martin was almost seemed personally offended at the thought of it, and but it is, I think, something that's going to require more I imagine that's going to be a big cause for debate in the coming months, is going to be not our finances, and then also does that mean it's a good time to be taking out extra debt?
And something else I want to jump on with what Justin said in terms of Medicaid. I mean, $1 billion of the new spending is on Medicaid alone. And that is something that all states are grappling with, trying to control spending when it comes to Medicaid. But it's the Department of Human Services is the largest budget line item for one single agency, and Medicaid is just continuing to eat up a lot more funds. And that is something that we really just need a long-term plan for when it comes to controlling that spending and balancing what we're actually taking in.
Whitney, you just mentioned the reaction to some federal cuts that were happening. Was there anything else in the budget that was, you could tell, a reaction to the federal situation?
Yeah, so a lot of that Department of Human Services growth, it can actually be tied a little bit to taking on additional costs. We are not yet supposed to be paying for the extra Medicaid checks that we need to do, that we're supposed to be checking income and other eligibility more frequently under the One Big Beautiful Act that was passed over the summer. But we are going to be taking on more SNAP funding because of administrative error rates that reflect just how payments went out. So I think that we have to accept that the federal government isn't as generous as it previously was. Another area that's a concern is FEMA, is emergency management responses, and getting less money potentially from the federal government if we have a natural disaster here. So that is where I think that $100 million federal fund comes from, but I'm not even sure. They want it to be very flexible, but how do we plan for something that could be potentially catastrophic, like if we saw previously?
And I just want to jump in to say, it's like, as Whitney said, like, it's $100 million. The feds kick in 30, 40, maybe $50 billion a year. It's somewhere in that neighborhood. 100 million is a drop in the bucket compared to all of that.
Stephen, you earlier mentioned this budget being very similar to last year's. Do you think that we will run into an impasse again?
That's the $1 million, or $53.3 billion question. I think that it seems like, I think having Pittman start off by saying we know we're gonna have to pull into the rainy day fund or pull out of the rainy day fund means that, like, there's maybe a little more realism. Old time Capitol hands will tell you, I talked to former Majority Leader Kerry Benninghoff, now a rank and filer, but he noted that election years, people just kind of want to get this done and get out. Whether it's you don't want to risk the backlash of a budget gone wrong, or you just don't want to be in Harrisburg. You want to be out in your district, showing your face, knocking on doors, kissing babies. That just kind of adds this extra incentive to not be in Harrisburg, to not be worrying about the day-to-day governance, be worrying about how do you get reelected. That's a pretty big incentive. If that's enough to mean the budget's done on, May 1st, I don't know. But I do think you have to weigh the fact that it is an election year and people want to get reelected.
Like Stephen said, it is an election year. What races are you watching?
Ooh, there's a lot of races to watch in Pennsylvania. I'm always heavily focused on the gubernatorial race. I think it's going to be an interesting contest between Governor Shapiro and most likely Treasurer Stacey Garrity. Right now, she has no opposition in the GOP primary, and it's already getting, tense and contentious. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch, and I think we'll have, a lot of consequences on, where Josh Shapiro goes from here. There's obviously been talks about him potentially running for president. So that'll be an interesting race to watch, to see how he positions himself politically, ideologically. And I think Pennsylvania's congressional races are definitely going to be something to watch. There's a narrow divide in the U.S. House, and given that, there were 2 seats that flipped last cycle, there's going to be a lot of money pouring into congressional races in the 8th Congressional District and the 7th Congressional District. So those are 2 I'm going to be watching pretty closely as well.
Do you foresee that the actions of the Trump administration may have an impact on the result of these races?
It's certainly possible. I mean, I think, as we saw last November in state Supreme Court retention races, Democrats, I think, quickly looked to frame that as a rebuke of the Trump administration, a rebuke of the federal government shutdown. And I think as far as Democrats and their messaging is concerned, they're going to look to tie Republicans to chaos in Washington, D.C. as much as possible. Well, I think Republicans, on the other hand, are going to, point to the One Big Beautiful Bill Act and, try and sell it as something that will help taxpayers and help their bottom line. So there's a lot to watch.
Whitney, you wrote that Republican candidate for governor and state treasurer currently, Stacey Garrity, endorsed Jason Ritchie for lieutenant governor. What can you tell us about him?
Not much. He has run for governor in the past, but didn't make it to the primary. So he has not actually had any elected official positions that I could find. He is, however, the chair of the Allegheny Republican Party. And so I think that she wanted somebody who could just really match with her team, but I'm a little curious to see about his actual credentials when it comes to fundraising and getting that necessary support to get her all the way to defeating Shapiro in November. I think that Shapiro's got a pretty significant war chest that is going to make defeating him pretty difficult if they can't get those funds.
Stephen, you wrote that this year's election should, quote, favor Democrats if historic trends hold, end quote. Why is that?
Well, it's just kind of a truism of American politics. There have been only a handful of elections where the party that is in the White House does well in midterm elections. Now, one of them, arguably, devil is in the details, 2022, because that was a year where Joe Biden, Democrat, was in the office. Pennsylvania Democrats did really well that year. Josh Shapiro won by a landslide, and they also flipped the state house. But that's so, like, I think there needs to be the big asterisk of the Trump era has been a turning on the head of many of the political truisms that have, run poli-sci departments and political journalism decision-making for a while. But that's just kind of the way it typically is. Counters that would be there have been media reports that Trump is saying he's going to campaign like it's a presidential year. He has a huge amount of money in his super PAC that he can use at his discretion. I'm not saying that any of that would, I have no inside sourcing telling me that would come to Pennsylvania. I think it'd be a pretty good bet if I was a betting man to say that some of that will come to Pennsylvania, though. So with all that said, I think Democrats are really excited. I think Republicans feel a little more leery. But anything really can happen in these elections. It's just a matter of do people get motivated to go out and vote?
Is there a chance that the Pennsylvania House and Senate could flip party majorities?
The House is a one-vote divide between Democrats and Republicans, and the Senate Democrats need two to flip, or basically to effectively flip if they win the governorship. So yes, 100%. But Republicans just as easily, if it's a better year than anyone thinks, they could get a chamber back, or who knows.
And then what would happen if they do flip and Josh Shapiro gets reelected governor, Stacey Garrity gets elected governor? What would that mean for the state?
Well, I think in the event that the state Senate flips to Democratic control, that gives, Shapiro basically a blank check to accomplish whatever he wants to. And I think, that's something we haven't seen with a Democratic governor in a while now. His predecessor, Governor Tom Wolf, was up against a Republican House and a Republican Senate pretty much his entire tenure, and I think had some difficulties accomplishing his big projects that he wanted to get done. Whereas if one chamber of the Senate flips and the House holds blue for Democrats, that gives Shapiro a lot of power to enact his agenda. I think on the flip side, if there's one seat that Republicans pick up in the House, that makes Shapiro's job a little bit more difficult in trying to get his agenda across the finish line.
Well, Stephen, I wanted to ask you about an article that you wrote that, there now may be an open seat in the House because there is a state representative who is resigning from their position due to what you called, quote, ethics concerns. Can you talk about what happened?
Well, I should say, the state rep, Seth has said that, did not say why he resigned. He said he was just sick of being in the building. But his resignation came as there was more and more pushback on him from some Democrats and from some outside groups that basically because he got a side job, which is totally legal under state law, running the trade association for the concrete and aggregates industry. So, the sort of things that you use to build roads, but also just lay foundations, those sort of things. I had talked to Grove about this in December. He said that, the job does involve lobbying. He recused himself as needed. And, that overall it was just, this is allowable under state law. But ethics experts who I talked to and, I've talked to some of my fellow reporters have noted that, conflicts of interest are real, and having someone actively representing a group that is registered at the lobby, the General Assembly, they hire a lobbyist, leading that group while also being a state legislator who sets the very policy that they are attempting to impact is pretty definitionally a conflict of interest. Either way, Grove is now gone. That seat's not going to flip. I think what I said on social media is that eat my hat. I don't own many hats, but if someone brings me one, I'll eat it. But with that said, I think it just points to the fact that Harrisburg, I've had many people compare it to the Wild Wild West when it comes to ethics laws, and this is just kind of another example of that in action.
Now we only have about 5 minutes left. Whitney, as we get into budget hearings, what are some things you're looking at and writing about?
Yeah, so I am going to be very focused on both healthcare and education. I've already mentioned Medicaid. I'm curious to see how we're going to be controlling those funds, those expenses, and planning long term to keep that entitlement program funded. And there are things Pennsylvania can do to save money, but they could potentially curb services for Pennsylvanians. I am also very curious to keep watching adequacy funding. You know, we are a few years after a pivotal court ruling that ruled how we are funding our schools is unconstitutional in the Commonwealth. And so trying to accommodate that and rebalance, I think that some schools are saying it's not going fast enough, and other schools are getting extra dollars in the budget. William Penn, which is in the speaker's district, got extra money in the last budget. So I think that we're going to have to keep looking at both of those and seeing how the Commonwealth is looking at these long term and whether we're actually meeting what services people are asking for.
Stephen, do you have any articles coming up?
I've been looking into what does Pennsylvania's level of cooperation with ICE actually look like. Immigration law is complex, and law enforcement is or can be quite secretive. So that's been a journey. And then otherwise, we'll just be picking apart this budget address. And I should say, I also have a weekly newsletter that has chock full of other fun observations about state government that you can subscribe to on spotlightpa.org.
And Justin, what are you working on?
I'm going to be focusing a lot on the governor's data center and AI proposals. He also pitched some AI protections and protections around children and their use of these products. So that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on as I take a statewide look at data center development across PA, because that's something I think that's going to be gaining a lot of pushback and a lot of support in certain areas. So it's something to watch.
All right, that'll have to be the last word. Our guests today have been Justin Sweitzer, Managing Editor of City and State PA, Stephen Caruso, Capitol Reporter with Spotlight PA, and Whitney Downard, a reporter with the Pennsylvania Capital Star. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
That's it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Ellen Frantz. Thanks for watching.
Full episodes of politics and policy content like the program you just listened to are available to stream with the PCN Select app. Discover other shows like the Capitol Preview, On the Issues, candidate interviews, and more. To learn more about PCN's mission and to support PCN with a donation, visit PCNTV.com. This link and others can be found in our show notes. We appreciate your support.